The movie begins with the main character, Susan, walking through a gray, monotonous city, lost in thought about the world. She reflects on its binary nature, love and death, religion and work, and how most things on Earth, once profound, have become mundane, taken for granted, and ignored. In the next scene, we meet Michael, the second protagonist. He lies in bed beside a woman he brought home from a bar. Unable to sleep, he wakes her up and asks her to leave, claiming he can't rest with someone else in bed. The woman, offended, protests that she's being dismissed so casually after spending the night together. Michael, however, shrugs it off, insisting it's just his quirk. The story shifts back to Susan, now walking along a desolate beach with her sister. Susan, in a low mood, suggests throwing stones at seagulls. Through their conversation, we learn that Susan is grappling with a painful breakup.
Who finds? Shut up and throw!
After venting her frustrations, Susan decides it's time to return to work. Meanwhile, Michael is seen sailing to his workplace on a small boat. Upon arrival, he exchanges pleasantries with his boss, who is smoking a cigarette. Susan arrives at her workplace and is greeted in the parking lot by a colleague who doesn't inquire about her extended absence. Susan candidly explains she wasn't ill, but was dealing with depression following her breakup. Susan works in epidemiology, and upon entering, a nurse informs her about a peculiar new patient. The patient has inexplicably lost their sense of smell after previously experiencing an overwhelming loss of the will to live.
Look, listen, he called me up, right, and he told me he was coming home. And then all of a sudden his voice breaks and he bursts into tears. And then he starts telling me that he doesn't see any meaning to life.
Despite their examination, Susan and her colleagues find no clear indication of a virus. However, her colleague Stephen mentions that similar cases have been reported globally, with no apparent connections among the patients. The focus shifts back to Michael, who works as a chef in a bustling restaurant. In the kitchen, Michael discusses his morning encounter with the girl he sent away with his friend James. James urges Michael to break his cycle of fleeting encounters, advising him to try feeding a girl breakfast and fostering a real relationship before growing old and lonely. In the next scene, Michael and Susan meet for the first time. Susan, who lives above the restaurant where Michael works, is smoking by her window while talking on the phone. Michael notices her and asks for a cigarette. She begrudgingly tosses him one with a lighter. Michael seizes the opportunity to introduce himself.
How about board and lodging while we're at it?
Nah, I don't even know your name.
But Susan swiftly rebuffs his attempt. The following day, Susan attends a morning meeting with her colleagues to discuss the mysterious illness. They explore theories about the virus, which causes people to cry uncontrollably before losing their sense of smell entirely. Despite their brainstorming, no concrete conclusions are reached, and everyone returns to their tasks. We then see scenes of those infected by the disease. It begins with an emotional breakdown. People suddenly cry, overwhelmed by memories of past regrets, lost loves, and unfulfilled dreams. After this wave of melancholy, they lose their sense of smell entirely. Scientists worldwide scramble to identify the cause, but their efforts remain fruitless. The illness is eventually given a name, and people begin wearing masks, though the mode of transmission remains unknown. Michael goes to work as usual, only to find the restaurant empty. The epidemic, which has dulled people's senses, has made haute cuisine irrelevant. With no diners to serve, Michael and the other chefs are left idle. They close the restaurant and head home. Outside, Michael encounters Susan pulling into her driveway. She teasingly calls him a sailor, and he corrects her, saying he's a chef. Susan quips that her father used to call everyone a sailor. Michael, smiling, invites her to the restaurant, pointing out that there's plenty of uneaten food in the kitchen. To his surprise, Susan agrees. Michael treats Susan to a variety of dishes and desserts at the restaurant. However, midway through the evening, Susan unexpectedly begins to cry.
That sailor stuff reminds me of him, my dad. I miss him so much.
Concerned, Michael hugs her and tries to comfort her, but her sobbing only intensifies. In an attempt to console her, he offers to walk her home. Once there, Michael puts Susan to bed and waits until she falls asleep. Suddenly, he begins crying himself. Awakened by his tears, Susan embraces him tightly, wanting to ensure he doesn't feel alone during such a vulnerable moment. They fall asleep together, despite Michael's earlier claim that he couldn't share a bed with anyone. In the morning, they wake up and realize that they've both lost their sense of smell. After a brief conversation, Michael decides to leave and gets on with his day. At work, Susan confides in her colleague about Michael. While she admits to liking him, she still describes him as an asshole. Meanwhile, Michael's workplace is adapting to the widespread loss of smell. The team discusses how they must cook differently, enhancing flavors to compensate for the diminished sense of taste that accompanies the loss of smell. The film reflects on the impact of losing smell, how certain scents once triggered cherished memories, like the smell of freshly cut grass from childhood or the scent of gasoline during a first boat ride. Despite this loss, life continues, and people find new ways to create memories, focusing on other senses instead. Later, Michael invites Susan for a walk before work. Reluctantly, she agrees. As they stroll through the streets, Susan opens up about her past relationships and shares more about herself. They stumble upon a group of people recreating scents through other senses and their imagination. Participants describe smells with sound and vivid descriptions, attempting to relive past experiences. Intrigued, Michael and Susan join in, enjoying the unique and moving activity. Afterward, Michael asks Susan what they should do next, subtly implying that he'd like to visit her place. She playfully responds, asking him what he wants. Following a brief flirtation, they kiss, and the scene transitions to Susan's apartment, where they make love. However, the intimacy is short-lived. Echoing the film's opening, Susan asks Michael to leave, explaining that she doesn't yet trust him and needs to be alone. Michael, visibly upset, worries he might have said or done something wrong. Before leaving, he gives her his card with his address and phone number, telling her to call if she wants to see him again. Alone in the street, Michael encounters a religious fanatic, proclaiming that the virus is God's punishment and urging people to repent. Troubled, Michael heads home, where he spends a sleepless night reflecting on Susan and the events unfolding around him. Time passes, and Michael visits a cemetery, where he meets an elderly couple. From their brief conversation, it becomes clear they are the parents of Michael's late wife or girlfriend.
She loved flowers, Michael.
This encounter sheds light on Michael's deep-seated emotions and his struggles with letting go of the past. His reluctance to open up to new relationships stems from unresolved grief over his lost love. Meanwhile, Susan has her own struggles. She discusses her ex-boyfriend's upcoming wedding with her sister, revealing lingering feelings and unresolved emotions. Her coldness in asking Michael to leave becomes more understandable. Life continues much as before. Michael goes about his work, occasionally glancing out the window at Susan. Susan, meanwhile, throws herself into her work, determined to uncover the origin of the mysterious disease. Speculations about the virus's cause swirl worldwide. Some believe it marks a stage in the looming apocalypse. Others claim it's a government conspiracy designed to stimulate the economy, and still others propose an extraterrestrial origin. One day at work, Susan encounters an unsettling incident. In one of the laboratories, a colleague suffers a sudden, intense panic attack. The other employees attempt to calm him, administering a tranquilizer, but it has little effect. Susan sits with him, speaking gently in an effort to bring him back to himself. Later, as Susan walks to her car after work, she experiences a similar sudden panic attack. A passing coworker notices her distress and stops to help. At the same time, Michael faces a comparable situation at work, as does nearly everyone on the planet. A wave of collective panic sweeps through humanity, soon followed by an overpowering primal hunger. People pounce on anything they can consume: cooked food, raw meat, flowers, anything remotely edible. The frenzy is chaotic and uncontrollable. Once the episode passes, individuals regain awareness, bewildered and horrified by their actions. The next day, as Michael returns home from work, he finds Susan sitting quietly at his doorstep. No words are needed. They understand each other instantly and dissolve into a loving embrace. That evening, lying together in bed, Michael voices his fear. Will they lose their other senses too?
Do you think we'll lose our other senses too?
Smell and taste are related.
Susan offers no answer, and they find solace in their love, making love again. The following morning is lighthearted as they flirt and tease, agreeing that they should see each other more often. Michael admits he might lose his job, as he believes there's no future for a chef in a world without taste. When Michael arrives at work, he's greeted by a somber sight. The restaurant is closed, and his director is sitting alone, drinking heavily. The director declares that the business is finished, but Michael counters with optimism. He insists that life will go on, and people will return to the restaurant, seeking the joy of gathering, sharing meals, and spending time together. Gradually, the world begins to adapt and rebuild. People resume their routines, though in new and unexpected ways. Michael starts exploring innovative approaches to cooking, focusing on sight, sound, and the healthful qualities of food. Though the senses of taste and smell are gone, others grow more acute. Humanity compensates for its loss by embracing different pleasures. Restaurants reopen, not as places of culinary indulgence, but as spaces for sensory and social experiences. Patrons now savor the texture and temperature of their food, the vibrant colors on their plates, and the harmonious clinking of glasses. In the evening, Michael and Susan take a bath together, enjoying each other. Susan shaves Michael's beard, after which he decides to shave Susan too. After putting bubble bath on her face, he decides to lick her. He notices that the consistency of the foam is very soft and feels good. They start eating the shaving foam and then start eating soap while kissing each other. After the baths, they get drunk and dance in each other's arms. Susan suggests to Michael that they play a game where they tell each other a fact about themselves that no one else knows. Susan goes first. This explains a lot to us. Apparently for this reason, Susan broke up with her previous boyfriend, who, as we found out from their conversation with her sister, is already married and his girlfriend is pregnant. Michael's turn comes and he tells us that he had a girlfriend who got sick. He couldn't be around her and ran away, leaving her to die alone. He forces himself to go to her grave to feel guilty, but the guilt doesn't come. They conclude that Michael is a scumbag, but now things are different. The couple goes to a nightclub where they enjoy each other and what happens to them. The next day, Susan and her colleagues contact a laboratory in Bangkok seeking updates on the virus. A scientist there urgently describes a new development. People are now succumbing to uncontrollable hatred, anger, and rage. The world descends into chaos, consumed by violence and brutality. Across the globe, people release the lifetime of rage and resentment they've bottled up, turning on one another with devastating consequences. Michael and Susan find solace in each other. Wrapping themselves in a blanket, they sit on the bed, quietly awaiting the inevitable. In these final moments before the storm overtakes them, they savor the fleeting peace and the connection they share, embracing the preciousness of what they have before it's lost. The city begins to impose a partial quarantine in areas where outbreaks of aggression have been reported. Unfortunately, both Susan's house and Michael's restaurant fall within the quarantine zones. The restaurant is mandated to prepare food for the isolated residents 3 times a day, a requirement the reluctant director agrees to under government pressure. That evening, Michael waits for Susan outside her workplace and informs her that her building is now off limits, effectively leaving her homeless.
You can choose between a gym full of those not infected out behind the bus station, or you can come home with me.
Tough one.
They drive to Michael's house, passing scenes of chaos as they navigate the streets. When they reach Michael's house, they roll down the car windows to savor the sounds of the world one last time before everything is drowned in silence. Inside the house, they kiss through their medical masks and settle into their new reality. But the fragile peace is shattered when Michael suddenly succumbs to an uncontrollable fit of aggression. He begins hurling vile insults at Susan.
But you're just like all the others. Don't you think that you matter? Because you don't. You're nothing.
His words cutting deep, and then turns his rage outward, smashing everything around him.
Fat and flour! Fat and flour!
Susan, caught off guard and overwhelmed, interprets his words as hidden hatred. Overcome with fear and hurt, she bolts from the house. The city outside is unrecognizable. Streets are littered with debris, and angry, screaming people wander aimlessly or lash out at whatever crosses their path. A lone, abandoned horse passes by, and a desperate young girl bangs on her car window, pleading to be let in. But Susan, still in a state of shock and disbelief, ignores her and continues driving. Meanwhile, Michael regains his senses, only to find himself sitting amid the wreckage of his trashed apartment. The weight of his actions hits him like a tidal wave, and he lets out a scream of anguish, but his scream is met with silence. He realizes he can no longer hear anything, not even his own voice. Stumbling outside, he encounters people in hazmat suits who wordlessly hand him a leaflet detailing quarantine instructions. They push him back into his apartment, gesturing for him to comply. Susan arrives at her workplace, only to find the offices in shambles. Desks are overturned, papers are scattered everywhere. As she walks through the wreckage, she spots one of her colleagues standing amidst the chaos, staring blankly. His face is a mask of despair as he mutters about the impossibility of finding a cure. Without another word, he turns and walks away, disappearing into the void of the abandoned corridors. Meanwhile, Michael sits in his wrecked apartment, consumed by despair. Periodically, people in hazmat suits appear at his door, leaving food trays, the very meals he once prepared with his own hands for others. Back at her office, Susan sits alone, staring at the remnants of what was once her workplace. She contemplates her next move, her mind racing with anger and hopelessness. Suddenly, her phone rings. It's Michael. Desperate and clinging to a shred of hope, he speaks into the receiver, knowing she likely cannot hear him. He begs for her forgiveness, explaining that his hateful words were not his own, but the result of the disease controlling him. His voice cracks as he pleads, "I didn't mean it, Susan. Please, it wasn't me." Susan stares at the phone in her hand, tears welling up in her eyes. Overwhelmed by a surge of rage, she throws it against the wall, watching it shatter, The disease has taken hold of her now, too. Her body trembles with fury as she begins to destroy everything around her, papers, lab equipment, and furniture. On the other end, Michael keeps talking.
Why?
When the line goes silent, he lowers the phone, staring blankly at the screen. With nowhere else to turn, Michael directs his gaze toward the television. Susan wakes up in the lab, now deaf like everyone else. Disoriented, she wanders through the empty, wrecked facility. She comes across her colleague, who is slumped against a wall, his face marked with the aftermath of rage. Without a word, she steps around him and leaves the lab, knowing there's nothing left for her there. Meanwhile, Michael ventures out of his apartment for the first time since the chaos began. The streets are partially destroyed, littered with debris, and eerily quiet, except for the distant sounds of collapse. He walks through the remnants of the city and eventually arrives at his workplace. Inside the kitchen, he finds his boss lying on the floor. They exchange a glance, a silent acknowledgement of shared pain, and step outside for a smoke, the language of words now irrelevant. Elsewhere, Susan makes her way to her sister's house. Upon arrival, she scribbles a note. I was right about Michael. Her sister reads it and tries to comfort her. To lift Susan's spirits, she suggests they go out to throw stones, a pastime they once used to vent frustration. As time passes, the world begins to reorganize itself under the new conditions. People return to their jobs. Though many are visibly haunted by the past events, some begin learning sign language, preparing for a future where words are no longer spoken. Michael returns to his work, often stealing glances at Susan's empty apartment. The world adapts. At a local bar, Michael witnesses patrons leaning against instruments and speakers, trying to feel the vibrations of the music through their bodies. Life goes on. People adjust to the darkness in their lives, both literal and figurative. Some focus on practical survival skills, preparing for the worst. Susan spends quiet days with her sister and her children, cherishing moments of simple joy. Michael, in contrast, spirals into despair. One night, drunk and consumed by grief, he stands under Susan's window and screams into the void. But there is no one there to hear him. Darkness falls over the world. But before the light fades completely, humanity experiences an awakening. People come to understand true happiness, the joy of living, the profound gratitude for love, and the desire to connect. For Michael and Susan, this realization is no different. They feel an urgent pull to be with each other, to rekindle the connection they had. The final scene shows Michael and Susan running into each other's arms. Less than a meter apart, they freeze as their sight fades completely. In the darkness, they hold one another tightly. They feel each other's breath, the wet streaks of tears on their cheeks, and the pounding of their hearts. Sightless but profoundly aware, they know all they need to know. They are together. As the movie ends, the world plunges into complete darkness. But if anyone could see them now, they would witness the purest form of love. Two souls intertwined, finding light in each other even as the world fades away.